You're listening to Under the Skin with Russell Brand. My guest today is Kehinde Andrews, an author and associate professor in sociology, and is also doing the first Black Studies degree anywhere in Europe at Birmingham City University. His research specialism is race and racism. He is director of the Centre for Critical Social Research, founder of the Organisation of Black Unity, and co-chair of the Black Studies Association. He's contributed features to The Guardian, and his new book, Black Radicalism, is out next year. Welcome, Kai.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
It's really great that you come on. As you know, my motivation for doing these podcasts is because I'm at SOAS University. I've been doing a degree religion in global politics, and I felt like the sort of dilettante's glee at new information. And then, when I was sort of getting given essays and stuff, I was thinking, hold on a minute, I could meet these people. I've been on the telly. So this is part of that. This is, in a way, it's like Make-A-Wish Foundation, just for making one person's wishes come true. We wanted to start around the area of empire because sort of national identity, ethnocentric national identity in particular, becoming very prevalent both in our country and America. Wanted to talk to you about colonial nostalgia, and would you explain what that term means and what this particular moment around Brexit and Trump, if you've got any analysis on them, like to kick us off with?
Yeah, so I mean the term colonial nostalgia, it kind of refers to, if you look at the public discourse, particularly around Brexit and the Vote Leave campaign and the idea that Britain is great and Britain can go back to the time it was great. Well, the time that Britain was great was when it was an empire, when it ruled over 25% of the world, when the colonies stretched out to the empire where the sun never sets. And that is the basis of Britain's wealth today, and that is kind of what people are looking back at. How do we go back to that colonial prestige of Britain, if you like?
So when we say greatness, we mean tyranny and oppression.
Effectively, yeah. This is what we're celebrating. And because we teach empire so badly, we don't really understand the horror. I mean, the British Empire killed more people than the Nazis. It was literally a form of fascism that laid waste to whole areas of the world and whole peoples of the world.
Kai, if an institution or nation killed more people than the Nazis, and the main reason we think the Nazis are bad is because they killed so many people, does that mean that the British Empire was worse than the Nazis?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, actually, the British Empire and the Nazis aren't separate in any way, shape or form. There's a book that Bauman, sociologist called Bauman, wrote, where it's called Holocaust and Modernity. And actually, he argues that how we think about the Holocaust is though it's somehow alien. It's so outside. It was so horrible. It could never possibly fit within our wonderful, enlightened society. But actually, in the book, he makes the argument that the West, modernity, capitalism, is the only society that could have produced the Holocaust. And the reason for that is racial science. When you think about the idea that the Jews aren't really people, and we can prove they're not people through measuring and through science. Well, that's race. That's the same racism which produced slavery, that says that I'm not fully a person and you can treat me like cattle. That's the same racism, the same science that proved the Jews were inhuman. And also, if you think about the amount of death, that scientific process of death, there's nothing new about that for the Holocaust. I mean, Belgium, they killed about 10 million people in the Congo. Slavery was millions and millions of people. So in a sense, the Holocaust is like the logic of capitalism, just done to people we consider white. And so it becomes, it's horrible.
Right. I suppose two things. Yes, of course, it was done to people that were white. And also, I suppose, in terms of the trajectory, it was a in inverted commas, civilized country with people living civilized lives, and the victims were civilized. So in a way, I suppose it reveals a lot about our presumptions around race, of you wouldn't even in a modern context, contemporary context, consider that was the same. Yeah, but hold on a minute, they was all living in Africa and that's not as bad because they didn't have net curtains.
Yeah. No, and that's the problem, right? So you see the logic of the Western imperialism in Europe for white people, and then you see, actually, this is terrible. But actually, if you look, if you think of the Holocaust as being one of many imperial terrible things that happened, it's really not even in the top 10, right?
Right, because it's the way that we categorise this information of like as if there's a handicap, a system applied. Yeah. These was white people, so that's the worst. Yeah. Then down there, like does that? So you're obviously right. Thanks for illuminating me on that. Now, how is that idea progressing, and how is that perpetuating the idea of racial science and that term I know from school, necropolitics? How is that continuing now? What's the front line of these arguments that they're most evident in the most evident form of slavery and Holocaust? What's the version of that we're living with now?
Yeah, so after the Holocaust, and then people see like racial science is terrible, and actually maybe we should move away from racial science. And before the Holocaust, it was just science. It wasn't racial science, and it wasn't controversial, right? That was just what we all kind of agreed. But when you see that happen to the Jews and see that the terror of it in Europe, we kind of abandon race. So you'll hear people will say race doesn't exist, race is problematic, we should move away from the idea of race, move to ethnicity. The problem is the way that we think about ethnicity is basically exactly the same way we thought about race. So there's different ethnic groups, but they're racialized. So I'm Caribbean, but then you lump in Caribbean with African under black. Then you have Asian, which is Indian, Pakistani, etc. Then you have mixed. And even if you look at the census, the hierarchy of white to black is actually visually represented, right? It's white, Irish, and then it's Asian, then it's mixed, then it's black. And you see that actually the way we talk about ethnicity still says that black people may not be inferior because of biology anymore. We're inferior because of our culture, because of our language, because of our traditions, because we haven't got any history. So it's just a different version of the same thing, effectively.
That's interesting. So power, you say, mutates, but doesn't often accede. You know, like it's like, oh, we can't do it in that way anymore, but here's a new way.
Yeah, exactly. And think about if you think about what's racism really fundamentally about. It's about creating a system that says you have Europe, white at the top, you have Africa, black at the bottom, and there's various gradations in between. And that is actually what global politics looks like today. It's not a coincidence that the poorest countries in the world are in Africa and the richest countries in the world are European, West, white countries. That's how it was designed 500 years ago, and that is exactly how it is today.
What possible other argument could there be other than previous colonial exploitation? Some actual meritocracy? Is that the actual argument of like, no, white Europe, it's more advanced, it's different, and Africa is primitive?
Well, that's how it's maintained. If you think about, are you doing a degree at SOAS and obviously yes. International Relations and International Development? I've been going around to a lot of places recently and saying, well, actually, what are they teaching you in international development? They're teaching you how to underdevelop parts of the world. I mean, there's a whole colonial education system. It isn't just about Britain. It's about the elite from Africa, Caribbean, Asia coming into Europe and learning about economic policies, political ideas, which are actually there in place to continue the oppression of their countries. So you have this idea that you can develop the global south through aid and through technology and through et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we've missed the point that actually these places of the world are poor because the West is rich. That was the same then as it is today. That hasn't changed in any way, shape or form.
It's integral, I suppose, isn't it, that story is concealed because it is at odds with the assumption of justice and merit that is required to maintain a power balance.
Yeah, exactly. I actually talk about whiteness as being more like a psychosis than like anything else, right? The idea of whiteness and progress and civilization, et cetera, the ideas in the Enlightenment that Europe is kind of the civilizing mission that spreads out truth to the world. That's not rational. I mean, there's no rational basis to that, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of, I don't know if you've read any critical whiteness studies, people like David Rodiger and Noel Ignatieff, who talk about the idea that you can kind of teach out whiteness. If only white people would understand the problem historically, then they'd change and become allies and we'd all be happy families. Actually, I argue it's much, much, much more serious than that. That the reason you have this myth of progress, etc., is because that within the political economy, the West needs to exploit the rest. And so what we do is we have this psychosis which says, actually, no, it's all right, it's fine, we're doing a good job, etc., etc. And that's to hide the fact that actually that we're really living on the back of children dying. I mean, that's what we're doing, right? Children die because of the system which gives us money. And so because we can't deal with that mentally, emotionally, we create these myths about how wonderful the world is.
Right, so it's like a psychosis that has to conceal its essence in order to perpetuate. And even a sort of a little while ago on that TV online news blog we did an episode on like literal kids mining for some resource for your mobile phone. So it made a very sort of clear connection between here we are in the West, ordinary people that don't feel like we've got blood on our hands, but in our handheld device is like, here he is, he's 7 years old, he's got to go down. Oh no, it's like abhorrent and doesn't, you feel like it doesn't belong in your understanding of the contemporary world. Now, one of these things about whiteness is power. Obviously, I, as a white person that feel like I have certain attitudes towards the state, and that my sense of alliance and allegiance would be countercultural. How am I categorized by like in the terms of this new emergent narrative around power and oppression?
It's interesting because this whole discussion about like white allies and how much, I had this. I was at Oxford yesterday talking about this, and sometimes I feel a bit like a stand-up comedian where you kind of go around and you play the audiences and you get different reactions and you test out your material.
It's good because I feel like an academic, because when you said I've done this at Oxford, I thought, good, I'm already at the same level as Oxford University with my questions.
But it was good because this question of whiteness came up. You know, what can white people do? Where do white people? What can we do to solve the problems, etc. And it's a tricky question because if you take what I'm arguing here, that whiteness is a psychosis, that is, and psychoses are irrational. So, and actually in the left, you can see this as much as you can see it on the right. So you have left-wing people, SWP, Marxists, who will make these global arguments about X, Y, Z, who will say they're on the side of the oppressed. But actually, when you look at what they're saying, they're just as deluded as the right-wing fascists. Because whiteness as a concept is so important. And I'll give you an example. So anybody who's black and goes to black events in the African Caribbean community, the SWP, Socialist Workers Party, they're more prevalent than the police. I mean, they're always there. And they're always there peddling Marxism. And I quite like Marxism, by the way. But one of these events, it was a few years ago, there was a strike of South African farm workers, and the teachers were also having a strike here. And in this kind of Marxist, we're all the working class, we're all workers, we're all in the same struggle, etc., etc., they were saying that we couldn't just support the workers in South Africa, we had to support the teachers, right? But let's think about this for a second. Workers in South Africa, farm workers, are poor. They're so poor because of trade policies that benefit British farmers and European farmers, our farmers, effectively. And that impoverishes them, it marginalizes them, and their conditions are conditions that we could never even contemplate, right? Now, teachers are paid out of taxation from that very system which exploits South African farmers. So when teachers are asking for better pensions and better pay, what they're asking for is more fruits from the exploitation of places like South Africa. So in no way, shape or form are these two people together. Actually, they're opposed, completely opposed, because teachers, anybody, myself as well, we make our money off their exploitation. And that's the psychosis of whiteness. Because you can't understand that actually all of us here are part of the problem, not necessarily the solution.
But when you have a systemic contradiction such as that one, within which your participation is involuntary, other than like I'm out of the system now, like how do you avoid that, and how can't alliances be formed on that basis? Like I was thinking then, if you think of power, like, you know, like what I thought was brilliant, that OJ documentary, when I thought that they used that OJ Simpson documentary to tell a story about race in the United States of America, stories about crime, stories about commerce, capitalism, racial tension. I mean, really, in a way that I could understand, told me a lot of important stories, and a lot of it was about O.J. Simpson's racial identity at a time when the civil rights movement, people were making huge sacrifices, and Muhammad Ali was like, sort of, you know, custodial sentence and gave up his belt and all of that stuff. But like there was an interesting moment where it said, well, why does O.J. Simpson, because he is an African American man, have the obligation to be like, you know, well, you've got to, like, you would know, white athlete or white star would have that obligation, would be expected to carry that mantle. So it began to sort of challenge what whiteness and blackness mean as a sort of categorization system. So like, if like, you know, what this distinction, I see there is a historic, colonial, and indeed contemporary continuation of these themes and categories, but there is a sort of a crossover, isn't there? Because, like, say, Barack Obama, when he was the president of the United States, he was an African American man, but he is in the same. If you use that argument about the South African farmers and the teachers, he is he's the president over Ferguson. How does that all work?
Yeah, I mean that, and this is part of the thing with psychosis. Is I don't say, look, that's what psychosis isn't just for white people in any way, shape, or form. Black people, many black people would also kind of embrace this kind of psychosis, right? I was one of the most critical people, still am one of the most critical people of Barack Obama's presidency. You have a black president after 8 years, literally every single indicator apart from employment for black people went down. And even if you look at employment, black wages went down so much that actually employment was basically irrelevant. And so you think then, well, what have we achieved? What's achieved by this? And actually the celebration of Obama, particularly by African Americans and black people here, and my mum cried when Obama was elected. That's part of that psychosis, right? That we think things are changing, when actually if you look at the evidence, it suggests that none of these things are actually changing. And in many ways they're getting worse.
So then what's the value of that as a category if it is ultimately, as you said, literally meaningless? In what sense is he an African-American president, other than like he's able to say, you know, how he felt in shops and that kind of stuff, and like, you know, like things you think, oh bloody hell, this is sort of amazing, and a fist bump, other than sort of literally superficial, which I suppose is sometimes what I think race ought to be in a utopia, like, you know, like a superficial monikers. What was the value and meaning of it? Would you say that there really wasn't any?
No, there was. So you'll find some academics who will be very critical of Obama, but say, well, look, it's limits of what he could do. That's the problem. We just move on. It's not that big a deal, right? I'd actually take the opposite approach and say that the symbolism of Obama, the point of Obama's blackness, one of the reasons why he got elected was part of to aid this idea of this psychosis, was to aid this idea of the American dream. For me, Barack Obama's blackness is violence in itself.
Go on.
Because what does it do? What is my mom's crying. My mom was a radical in the 60s and had all these politics about revolution, etc., etc. And she's there crying on the day this very neoliberal politician who never offered one single thing to black, never said he was going to do anything for black people. But we just kind of assume because he's black, this is going to have something, right? And then you see afterwards everybody's kind of praising the symbol. You've got a black family in the White House and Obama with young black men, but actually get beneath that symbol. What's that trying to do? That's trying to tell you that things have progressed, that things have changed, that there's progress is being made. But again, look at every single indicator tells you that for black people, particularly in America, things are getting worse, probably not better. And so the symbol of Obama and why his blackness, how he used his blackness and why he got, one of the reasons he got elected is because it keeps us more deluded and tied into a system which can never provide us freedom, justice, or equality. People
will hate being told that story, I fancy. Kehinde.
Probably. Yeah, it's not the most popular way to put things, but it's also the truth, right?
That's right. So that type of critique where you say, no, let's not get distracted by what appears attractive and what appears beautiful and promising. Look at how power is actually behaving. Yeah. So, to return to my prior point about, like, how do I, as a white person from a working class background whose attitude has always been like, look at me reaching for my little slice of the pie. like how do I participate? How do I when you say that about the British Empire, right? I sort of think, like, God, yeah, it's all built on like biscuit tins with Union Jacks on it and land and open glory, and like they were over the butchering people in India and Africa and doing whatever was required, and nation was always a front for corporations anyway, and the whole thing's been a blag, right? I'm on board. Yeah. So, like, how do we have alliances that aren't caught up in sort of bureaucracies such as that teacher South African farmer alliance? How do we go, well, let's let the radical white folk in, they'll be of some use? Or is it like, can it not work?
And this is the part of the material which I'm testing out and isn't maybe the best, because I'm a big Malcolm X fan. I love Malcolm X. And
me and all, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, no, more the merrier. And Malcolm, there's a story in the autobiography where Malcolm, a white lady comes to ask Malcolm, similar question, what can white people do? And he basically turns around and says, nothing, and then walks off, right? Oh. And he feels bad about it.
That's a burn.
That's a burn, right?
Off Malcolm X anyway. Probably a bit nervous. He's an intense guy.
Yeah. And she was crying and she was really upset. And he felt bad about it. He was like, okay, I shouldn't have said this. Actually, white people have a responsibility to go into white communities and make these arguments. I can't really advance much more than that. Look, one of the things that Malcolm used to do was just to go around and tell white people, literally, they were devil. I mean, he'd say they were evil. Like, look what you've done. Look at this critique. And I guess as a black scholar and activist, that's the most I can do. I don't know if I can have the answer to what you can do other than to prove the critique wrong. I would love to be wrong. But actually, if I'm looking historically, presently, currently, at the left as well as the right, I don't see how you break out of that psychosis. That's why I call it a psychosis, because it's completely irrational. There is nothing you can do to penetrate it. And actually, my work is more about what do we do as black people and how do we organise.
Of course, that must be, isn't it? Like how I would have a personal allegiance around like addiction or whatever, because that's just what I've been drawn to through my particular wound. Like, and that's where I feel, I know the score on that, so I can be relevant and I can be useful in that area. I can't go around campaigning on behalf of a group that I don't share the experience of. But what I feel like, pure conjecture, of course, given the nature of what I've just said, might be the solution. Or my question is it not that whether these categorizations are wherever we find ourselves within that sort of that peculiar color chart, oughtn't we be denying the category, transcending the categories, not denying what the narrative is, and was and has happened. And I'm aware of it now in the industries I work in. When I'm at meetings around television, I think, wow, we're all white still. I'm sort of aware of that and that's sort of super relevant. But what I'm interested in is that as long as our identity continues to reiterate those categories, even if it's through overthrowing them, aren't we continuing somehow to augment them by saying, well, no, this is our story and this is what it is. I completely accept the importance of it, but how do we ever go, right, we don't want it anymore, we don't want power to work in that way? How do we challenge it and dismantle it if we are wedded or welded somehow to our categories? Yeah,
and I think I think it really does. It's really about taking on board this critique in a very serious way. And I don't think the left, and I'm saying the left is a general thing, but, people on the left, Marxists, other academics, have done this in this sense. So, for example, if you look at mobilizations like Occupy Wall Street, we're the 99%. I'm sorry, that's an offensive way to look at global inequality. If you earn the average wage in Britain, you're in something like the top 4% of earners in the entire world.
Wow.
Just recognizing that the conditions that we, and not just white people, black people, all of us, right, have here, put us in a completely different situation to the conditions of people in the third world. So, for example, there was recently a child bereavement in our family, a circle of friends, because of a car accident. And 2 years later, everybody's still shocked by it, and they're still shook by it because it's so foreign. But actually, in many parts of the world, children just die all the time. I mean, a child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food. So what that means is we're protected from that the horrors of the system. So for us to pretend that we're all in this one big happy family of workers, that needs to go. I mean, if you take one thing, let's just take that out of the equation completely, and understand that all of us here, and me included, are complicit in this system and benefit from this system.
Yes.
But I don't think you see that in much of the left, unfortunately. That would be a starting point, and maybe you can build a proper politics after that.
A sort of awakening. Yeah, like what you said there, like that. There's that famous Orwell quote, the British working class is in India. But when I was on Bill Maher the other day, and it's sort of, they very much romanticise Obama, and they're very much the opening. I like Bill Maher, but the opening jokes were very much about. You're not a president like Obama. It was sort of very romantic and nostalgic and all of that. And then the subsequent conversation was again sort of about intricacies of the Democratic Party and the way they elect candidates. And I thought, this is why you have Trump, is because this doesn't appeal to people on a visceral level. You're not addressing the inability of conventional politics to tell a truthful, open, clear story. So how does politics have to alter? Say for us, how do you end up in it? Because I think both Brexit and Trump, I see them more as failures of the left or failures of truly progressive thinkers, as opposed to triumphs for the right. Yeah. So what is the obligation of progressive, even if you don't use the terms like left and right, because I can see how they're becoming sort of problematic and somewhat redundant, and they are part of the problem, I reckon. But
in many ways, the Trump and Brexit are a response to the logic of the left as well, in some ways. If you have this national politics that says, look, how do we get the most we can for the working class in the UK or the working class in America, which unfortunately a lot of the left has done, then being anti-immigrant and being a bit racist makes sense. I mean, that's a logical thing. That's a logical thing to do, and that's the history of the left, particularly in Britain as well. So, it really, think about the trade unions. Think about, like, people always say, let's go back to social democracy. My family came to this country under social democracy. There were colour bars, couldn't get taught in school.
What does that mean, colour bars?
So you weren't allowed to join the trade union, weren't allowed to go into this association, couldn't live in this area, etc., etc. Actually, under social democracy, the racism that we're experiencing now and saying, oh, this is terrible, it was like 5 times worse, right? Left-wing, social democracy, working class, and the racism was far more severe on an open level than it is today. So in some ways, these Trump and Brexit aren't alien to the left at all. It's like even Corbyn got criticised because he never really came out about Brexit, and because there is this strong left-wing argument that you want to protect wages, etc., etc. Because a lot of the left is framed around the nation state, right? How do you protect British workers? How do you protect American workers, etc.? And so what we need to do for the left is to have a much more radical approach to politics. And it's not like this never happened. So if you look at people like Eric Olin Wright, a neo-Marxist who worked with the Black Panthers, American neo-Marxist in the 70s. Emmanuel Wallerstein talks about world systems theory. So there is theory that says, look, we need to basically divest of our privileges in the West and really understand our place in the global system. That works there. Unfortunately, it hasn't necessarily worked to influence how politics works.
What do you mean divest of privilege? I didn't like the sound of that at all.
So it's about acknowledging. So, for example, as a black man, for example, I have to understand that I don't suffer most of the symptoms of racism. Right? I'm not unemployed. I don't get hassled by the police. I have high education. I earn more than most people in the country. Right? So I have to understand that I am in a privileged position. And I have to understand also that because I'm in that where that privilege comes from, it comes from the exploitation of people that look like me, which means that I then have to build a completely different politics that says how do we relate to the least of us, in a sense? How do we draw this global idea about child deaths and politics around the world, etc., etc. And understanding that to do this, I'm going to have to give up my privilege. And this is what people don't want to do, right? This is why probably why it'll never work. Because for us in the West to really have a radical politics, it will mean we have to give up our privileges. And to what extent are people willing to do that?
I suppose the power structures that perpetuate are dependent on our unwillingness to give up comfort. If people had a sort of a more spiritual, what would I want to say, attitude towards asceticism, if people were kind of hardened to the idea of, no, I know what's right, and you're not going to beguile me with your iPhones. If you're like, but it's very, very hard to get there. A couple of times a week, I think, would I be more happy if I was to fill my house with people who are refugees so that I didn't, and like, what would my sum total of happiness go up? I'd certainly be spending less time reflecting on, well, I shouldn't really be having this privilege, should I? But much more time going, bloody hell, who blocked the toilet? Or whatever it would be that day. But it requires that. Gandhi did this wicked speech about where he said, there's no point in us overthrowing the British, then replacing them with a comparable system. You may have heard this, given that you teach degree courses in racial politics. But then the bit where he goes, the fact is it comes down to the idea of our attitudes towards comfort. As long as we are addicted to comfort, then it's really hard. On some level, on a personal level, you have to go, this is where this isn't theory. This is where this isn't something you read about books. Go, am I prepared to give up my iPhone? Would I be happier if I had less stuff? On some level, I sort of feel I would be. There's a kind of fear, though, Kehinde, that prevents me from going, right, I'm just going to walk out into because I suppose my personal privilege and wealth is what I feel protects me from this system and from this world.
Yeah, and I can see why people aren't right. People know who wants to give up stuff, right? And particularly if you're working class, particularly if you're black, there's discrimination, right? So we're seeing that there's clearly unequal. It's clearly not fair, and we feel badly treated as well. So that's also part of the problem that says, well, actually, why am I going to give up this? I've worked quite hard to get it as well. But unfortunately, that's the reality. Huey Newton, the Black Panthers, wrote a book, Revolutionary Suicide. And he said this is what revolution is about: understanding that you have to be able to give up for those people who are less than. I mean, this is why I have very little faith in this happening in Europe, and in the fact the concept I always talk about as a radical concept is blackness, because it's my blackness, it's the way that I look, it's the hair, that's a connection to people who are at the literal bottom. So when we talk about the child that dies every 10 seconds, vast majority of those are in Africa, right? So that gives me a connection that you don't necessarily have, right?
No.
And that should give me a connection that I should have. And that should tie me into a politics and remind me this is a global struggle, not a national struggle, which is why I have a bit more faith in those kind of black movements than I would have in Western European movements, I guess.
If, however, the only people that care about that exploitation and, you know, even in the most severe forms such as child death are people that have a visible and cultural identification with it, and even then it remains theoretical and I don't know to what degree you're involved in activism, you know, how's anything going to change? In fact, it seemed to me that until you get to that point, that Huey Newton point about like self-sacrifice, which is really martyrdom, is an idea that again is resourced from theology. You know, it's like how without a spiritual component is radical change going to occur? Because how do human beings access ideas such as oneness, true fraternity, transcendence, relinquishing individual identity through social and cultural, like or material forms? Like, how do you go? You know, because it doesn't have the necessary potency. It's not emotive enough. It doesn't seem.
Yeah, I mean, there's two parts. I mean, one, I think in terms of, you look at the black struggle and that kind of global politics, there are people like Frantz Fanon. We'll talk about the idea, he was a Martinican post-colonial theorist, and he'll talk about that you need the sleeping beauty of the European working class to wake up, basically, and you need those allies to have this revolution. Even the Panthers would have said this because they were Marxists. Because of, like you said, that you need to have this almost spiritual, it's something beyond just rationality. It's something more than that. This is why I say it's probably never going to happen, right? One, we have a system which has always protected the Western working class, always, from the worst exploitation, provided comfort and wealth, and provided an outlet. So look at the left now, they're saying, look, can we just get a bigger share of the pie? Not can we change global poverty, can we get a bigger share of the pie? Yeah. And so I'd be unlikely to see that happen. But can you see that kind of more emotional, if you like, theological, spiritual in this concept of blackness? This is why I'd argue, that's a potential possibility. And rather than wait and try and get the allyship of people who I don't think we're ever going to have massive allyship, let's just go with what we have and organize what we have and produce a movement that can actually, that by itself would be enough to destabilize and kick the bucket a little bit.
I see. That's good. But it's, for me, it's somewhat entrenchant precisely because of its inability to transcend systems of categorization that have been previously established by the power dynamic that you seek to overthrow.
Well, no, because that's the thing about blackness. I mean, in some ways, you can say, and this is the critique we get a lot, this is racial categories, they're all from Europe, etc., etc., etc. But actually, blackness is the concept I'm talking about. It's really the opposite to race. I mean, race is about biology, it's about hierarchy, it's about Europeans looking at us and saying you're not really human. Blackness is us looking at each other and going, okay, we got the same African background, we got that descent. We're seeing these Europeans who are doing these terrible things. They're trying to categorize us in this way, and we're going to reject that. So blackness isn't about hierarchy, isn't about biology, isn't about genetics. It's about saying there's a shared meaning of color, there's a shared meaning of politics, and we come together and organize in order to benefit the community. But it doesn't have those elements of race. So it's a different concept for me.
I understand. Now, I want to shift to the idea of reparations, because it's sort of, I suppose it's a practical idea. Can you talk to us about that if Western wealth is founded on colonialism, that there could be redemptive measures? What is that idea?
So if you look through historically, it's very clear and very obvious that the wealth of the West is built on slavery, colonialism, and genocide, like very clear. If you just take slavery, for example, I mean, slavery is about 300-year system. Places like Britain, America, Europe, it's literally built off the back of it. Parts of London, Liverpool wouldn't really exist. Glasgow in Scotland likes to get off the hook with slavery, but my surname's Andrews, so that should tell you everything you need to know about slavery and Scotland. And if Birmingham, even, because Birmingham's not a port, we tend to get away as well from some of this slavery stink, if you like. But the Industrial Revolution, James Watt, Matthew Bolton, they were all heavily involved in slavery.
Were they?
Took lots and lots of money from slavery.
I don't know none of this.
Really? So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, which is typically seen to be the marker of the West, right? Yeah. And how progressive it is and science, etc., etc. Well, the first real commodity that was made in the Industrial Revolution was cotton. There ain't no cotton growing in Britain, right? I mean, they don't grow cotton here. Cotton was in the Americas, it was in the Caribbean. And so it was that commodity and that wealth from the cotton industry, which was from the slave trade, which really gets reinvested back into the Industrial Revolution, and therefore you're able to have the rest of the progress, et cetera, et cetera. So the money that you needed to have something like the Industrial Revolution is 100% tied up into slavery. Yeah. So that's what Birmingham, for example, made, I think, some large proportion of all the guns and all the shackles that were used in the entire slave trade.
We only made the guns and shackles. Yeah. We were barely involved.
Exactly. British ships, even things like finance capitalism, insurance starts with the slave trade. Lloyd's of London, who celebrated, I think it was 400 years anniversary the other day, the CEO comes on TV and says, we're happy to have our roots in insuring the merchant trade. And what she meant was literally the slave trade. That's how they talk about slave trade in Lloyd's of London, the merchant trade. It's great when it's psychosis.
They were referring to it sort of nostalgically.
Yeah, exactly.
When Lloyd's began, it were just a few ships transporting, we'll call them goods, around. Yeah. That's amazing.
It's better. So you can see the roots of our financial institutions, our cities. I mean, you probably couldn't have much of the wealth that we have today without slavery.
Capitalism, I suppose, like one component, sort of creating excess value, excess worth. So anything you can do to reduce overheads, like we found ways of reducing overheads. You nick stuff from other countries, get other people to work for no money at all, and that's the all the lion and the unicorn and the land and the hope of glory. That's what it conceals.
That's 100% what it does conceal. And so if you think about reparations in America, most of this work has been done in America, and they've tried to calculate on pretty strong legal precedents. So 300 years of unpaid labor. You just work out what the labor would have been, what the cost would have been, what people should have got paid for the work that they did. And then there's also precedents around trauma and abuse. So, for example, for the Holocaust we talked about earlier, Germany's paid out about 90 million or something like that. It's a number. Maybe more than that. Germany's actually paid out reparations for the harm that was caused. Right. So if we say these two categories and say that you've got to pay for unpaid labor, you've got to pay for trauma. In the States, they reckon it's anywhere between 4.9 and 15.6 trillion dollars that's owed to African Americans.
It would essentially unravel that nation, that system as we know it. That's why it can't be countenanced or discussed, because you can't have the United States of America now. We're framing it economically. And I read this wicked thing off of this Native American. He called himself, or maybe even called himself Indian, I can't remember, like activist. And he said all these sort of systems you lot come up with, Marxism, capitalism, they're all sort of your ideas went into none of them. We have a completely different framework for understanding reality. But and you can see that with something like reparation, that what it begins to do is unravel a national identity. It was curious, I thought, in that James Baldwin documentary, where he goes that the whole category of Negro is required in order for the dominant the dominant power, I don't know, sort of force, to have another identity to cast its shadow onto. That category is created in order for whiteness to prevail, not only economically, but also kind of psychologically. Because in a way, economics is a sort of an external system that comes from somewhere, and as all forms of categorization must. That these, I suppose, one of the things that we're arguing is that there is no essence to categorization. These are external forms that are retrospectively applied, except for that moment where you talked about blackness as having some veracity in terms of visual identification. But I was saying then that that how, like, with that reparation argument, you can't, like, sort of in a sense, like, what would happen, like, if you pursue that, where does that go?
Yeah, well, I guess this is the cul-de-sac of reparations. Is that the way to put it? I don't know. So logically, there's no real argument against reparations. You look at so people will talk about, it was a long time ago, things have passed, etc., etc. Yeah. But actually, the effects are still very, 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 very clear. Not just for the descendants of the enslaved, but also in Africa. I mean, just depopulating Africa to that extent alone has had a huge negative impact on the economy. So you can see the effects of slavery is still there. reparations were paid to the slave owners. Imagine that they actually gave reparations to the slave owners because there was that much money involved. They were like, "We'll have to give you some money, all right?"
We're so sorry you're losing your slaves. This must be a terrible hardship.
Exactly. There was a UCL, University College London, just did a Legacy of British Slavery project, and they've traced where it's equivalent of £2 billion that went to the British owners of slaves at emancipation went. And you can see it's in the church, it's in the middle class, it's in David Cameron's family.
Wow.
It's literally throughout the economy. So it's very clear there's a problem and there needs to be restitution paid for that problem. But you're right, though. When you start to add up these numbers, I mean, if it's 15 trillion in the States, what would that be for the UK? You're talking about, it's actually impossible. It's literally impossible for the West to pay this kind of sum of money. It would destroy West. It would destroy
It means
capital,
there is no West. In order to do it, it means that the West has to dismantle itself. That power, in fact, don't all arguments about power reach this nexus that, well, in order for the power to respond correctly, it would have to dismantle itself. Whether you're talking about a transnational corporation, if you're talking about Lloyd's, in order to behave rationally and acknowledge its origins, would have to not be Lloyd's anymore. Yeah. Or GM Motors, for that time, they were putting out cars they knew were going to catch fire, but it worked out cheaper to let it happen. The only sort of possible response is for them not to be. So the systemic changes required are so absolute that they, in a sense, defy the dynamic. Because it's like that. If you say, right, America, Britain, former colonial nations have to repay to Africa, and what I feel like is that transference of wealth to Africa. Unless there is systemic change, all you have now is some dominant forces within Africa behave in that way. Yeah. And in a way, isn't it a bit of a red herring? In that it's sort of, I sometimes think, is it still just happening? Like I sort of very simplistic and reductive, but bloody hell, what did you expect when you came on here? Like sort of my argument is a bit like that. People, it goes a bit like this, right? You can't have slavery no more. People have, like, it's bothering too many people, like, that have got influence. Okay, but what we can have is we'll pay people the absolute bare minimum. There'll be a subjugated underclass. You know what I mean? So things just move on. Like, power finds a way of remanifesting itself continually and making the minimum sort of compromises.
Yeah, which is why I think the power of the reparations argument, you follow it through to its logical conclusion, tells you that the problem is irresolvable within our political and economic system. And this is where you need to have a radical change. And actually what we should be arguing is for revolution. Like the change you need to have, the restitution that needs to be made, cannot be made in this. Again, to quote Malcolm X, this system is, it's impossible to have freedom, justice and equality for black people in the same way that it's impossible for a chicken to lay a duck egg. It's just not meant to happen, right? And once we realize that, we'll start thinking of much bigger solutions to our problems. That's the power, for me, that's the power of the reparations argument, to tell you how it's embedded in the system.
It is actually quite brilliant. Yeah, it is, because it leads you to the point of going, yeah, but hang on a minute, if you did that, there would be no America. And then that tells you, America is therefore built on it.
Exactly, and that's the problem. So let's think about different solutions. And when you talk about power manifesting and giving concessions, this is kind of what we see with the reparations debate. So if CARICOM, which is a collection of Caribbean countries, are currently arguing for reparations. And they've kind of stopped asking for money now. It's about, can we get some development aid? Can we get an apology? Can we get some education?
No. Well, we'll do the apology quietly. Sorry.
It's a different set of demands. A set of demands that the West could do, right? It's not impossible. They could do this, and then it could absolve them of their guilt to say, well, look, we apologize. We give you this development aid. We wiped off third world debt. But actually, it didn't change the problem. The problem's still there. The issues are still there. The structures are still there. So you can actually do reparations in a way that makes things worse, not better, unfortunately.
Yes, I see. But it's like it's one of those threads that if you pull at it, things fall apart. It makes me... You're right. So what are you going to spend the rest of your... I mean, you might not know. But what are your most immediate objectives in terms of bringing about change? Where do you, like, now that you know all this stuff, now that you're a teacher of this stuff in your position you're in, what are you going to do?
So I think in terms of the book that's coming out next year, Black Radicalism, is a manifesto theoretically, but also practically, to say, well, actually, what does Black radicalism mean? What does this politics do? What does it lead us to? And what it leads us to is to an organization that transcends a nation state, that connects us to the poorest and the most abject in our condition, and says, actually, let's work on building revolution. And so it's kind of built on, so when Malcolm X, I'll probably mention Malcolm like 10 more times before we finish. When Malcolm dies, he's working on the organization of Afro-American unity. And he says this organization is the revolutionary organization because you have a place here, you have a place in New York, a place in Caribbean, a place in Jamaica, a place in Ghana, a place in all over the world. And then you connect this organization together, and now you've got that kind of unity and solidarity across borders that can actually have a proper revolutionary change. So this is the work that I'm trying to do currently.
Hey, what do you think is the significance of Malcolm X's Islam?
In what sense do you mean?
Well, like, he was a Muslim. He was a proper core
yeah,
Muslim.
He was a devout Muslim.
So, that's like you, because you're coming at him from the angle of being a black man in England 2017. Like, isn't he as much, or could it be argued that he's a Muslim icon as well as a African American or black icon? And how do those categories intersect, particularly in a climate where Islamophobia is so present?
Yeah, so I think Malcolm being...
good question came out of nowhere.
Malcolm being a Muslim is not incidental, right? And actually, when Malcolm becomes really radical, so Malcolm's in the Nation of Islam for about 13 years when he comes out of prison, and it transforms him. But the Nation of Islam is very much a religious organization in that it says that the solution to black people's problems is to become Muslim. And that's kind of it. You just become Muslim, and there's a prophecy where God's going to wipe away all the white people, and we'll be fine. So all you need to do is be a Muslim. Right, and that's the kind of religion, whether it's Islam or Christianity or whatever else, that you don't want to have, basically, because it limits you. You don't really do anything; you just pray. And eventually, Malcolm leaves because he sees the limits of that, and he becomes I think he's Sunni Muslim. He goes
Hajj and all
that.
Yeah,
he goes to Hajj. He goes to Mecca. He has a different kind of Islam, and he becomes in many ways more devout. So he finds the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, but very clearly in the Ballot or the Bullet speech in 1964, he starts off a speech, says, look, I'm a Muslim, but you need to leave your religion at home, keep your religion between you and your God, because this is not what we're talking about. When we do this organization work, this is black people stuff, and you can be whatever religion you want to be, but that has no impact on the politics. So Malcolm makes a very, very clear separation.
Do you think that was a political move, knowing that there was such an entrenchment Christianity within black population in America at that time, and he didn't want to cause a rift in that way?
But I think it's also important philosophically, because I think he's just saying, look, religion is something that makes you connect to the world and gives you spirituality and gives you something personally. Religion is not something that can solve any of our problems on earth.
Yeah, but that's, to me, mate, is the big argument of secularism, that religion is a private matter. Do it at home, do it in your own. Whereas I think of spirituality, if not religion, because it's such a hot potato, as having the motivational power to bring about the kind of revolution that's required. Because I don't if you're when you start to teeter on that precipice that you're taken to by thinking, when you pursue that reparation argument, when you think, oh my God, that would mean the dismantling of the entire Europe as we understand it, and the United States of America as we understand it. It also sort of reveals hidden narratives around the way that power transcends nation, has continued historically masked by flags and our own willingness to participate in their rituals, whether it's consumer rituals or daft secular holidays. Suddenly all of this is exposed. And I think that if you're asking people to take on board ideas as radical as, as simple as radical and seemingly trivial as put down your phone and start caring about little kids down a mine, the only way they're going to do that is with some connection to something transcendent. And I don't know, and I obviously say this is a white person. I was really enjoying the moment, mate, where I was talking to you about Malcolm X. I was like, there was bits where I was going to contradict you. I thought, this is good stuff. Professor of Black Studies now, and I'm wading in on the subject of Malcolm X. My feeling is that people are going to need to find a resource that's extremely potent in order to countenance such sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And I know the civil rights movement in its origins, sort of them early student type protests where them girls got murdered and all that. Right, people. I read the brilliant thing. I think it by that Malcolm Gladwell, so it's a pretty pop thing. But it was saying that the kind of allegiances were formed then were sort of local, communal, and tight. And I think it was an essay on how sort of the limitations of social media and how you need sort of proper connections. But then people also were Christian and that. There were other sort of there were transcendent belief systems. Whereas you said very plainly and overtly there, boldly, that religion's not going to do nothing. Well, I don't feel it's very, very evident to me the way that religion is used to sort of categorize, subjugate, divide, shame, and all those things. Yeah. But I feel that, how can we transcend these systems of categorization unless it is by saying there is some essence to the self and some essence to the whole? And
I think, like I said, I don't think it's so. Even with Malcolm, he says, look, split the two. You couldn't separate his Islam from his politics, right? And I think that does motivate people to do things. I think the key thing is to say that there isn't one religious answer. And I think that's what Malcolm's basically trying to say. So if you're a Christian and this motivates you, if you're a Muslim, this motivates you, if you're Jewish and it motivates you, whatever religion you are, we use that to motivate you. But actually, in terms of the program, in terms of what we're going to do, in terms of where we go next, in terms of the alliances that we make, religion's just going to get in the way on every level, right? Yeah. And separate and saying that, look, the earthly problems that we have are the earthly problems that we have. And in some senses, blackness, the way Malcolm talks about it, the way I'll talk about it, has that version of spirituality to it. It has that other connection to it.
But in the same way as that you're saying that Malcolm X meant when he was saying religion will get in the way, won't ultimately race get in the way? If you take your argument of blackness as the motivating sort of bond for a sort of a revolutionary movement, where does that? What's the goal of that? Where does that, like, ta-da, we've won? What's the what?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea is always, like, I guess, if you look at Malcolm's politics, would be revolutionary Pan-Africanism, like the African Revolution, and that's kind of when, like, you've got rid of Europe and China, et cetera, and you've got a different economy, and you've got the politics, right? But that's never been the end for that politics. Always said, well, look, Africa can't, and black people in general can't take part in the global revolution because we ain't got nothing. Like, we don't have anything. Nobody calls on black people for nothing. But when you have a power base, and if you could do this revolution, that would firstly probably undermine Western capitalism to the point it would no longer exist. But it would give you the ability to join in with other revolutions and other groups and support those groups. So the black revolution is, if you like, the starting point to the global revolution. But you have to have that black revolution first, I guess, is the argument.
Yeah, that does sort of make. Why is that? Why would it have to start? Because it has to be at the level of the most oppressed or the most severe. Why?
Well, I guess in theory you could say that it could start in China or it could start other parts of the world. But if we're saying, look, from a black perspective, we say, look, this is, and also if you take that logic of the most severe, the worst oppression, there is a strong argument for Africa being that place, and I suppose which may motivate it
because of the economic ramifications as well. Yeah. Like if Africa as a continent says we don't want like all of that, we want a clean slate from that. So in the bloody hell, when you think about that debt cancellation stuff, it's not like and as an act of largesse, we will cancel that debt, what we give you by nicking your stuff and killing your people. It's not like an act of kindness, is it? The debt cancellation. It's like stop insulting, adding insult to injury.
Yeah, again, I keep quoting Malcolm again, but he's great in the metaphors. He says, if you stab me in the back and then pull out a knife 6 inches, then I'm not going to thank you for it. Right? Good. And that's what debt cancellation effectively is. It's like pulling out the knife 6 inches. The knife's still there. You haven't done anything. You haven't changed it. Debt cancellation, the debt in the first place was just a neo-colonial tool to keep people impoverished. And actually, so none of the things that the West will ever offer you is really solving the problem. You've got to take the knife out and heal the wound.
How do you get on with making these arguments outside of academia? How do you get on with young black people that are not within academia, e.g.? How do you convey these kind of ideas? Are you able to? Is that happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. So, like, we started the Harambee Organization of Black Unity. This is one of the things, that's the kind of the root of it. So we literally took Malcolm when he died, before he dies, has a organization of Afro-American unity, has a constitution which nobody ever talks about. It says this is what you should do, and we said, okay, let's do it. Like, let's just see if it works. And so we're working in Birmingham to talk to people, talk to young people, older people. We're in an early stage, but we are constantly having these conversations outside campus, on campus as well. And you'll be probably not surprised. People relate to them. People understand them. People get that this world could never provide for them.
That's brilliant, because I suppose even if you don't know it with knowledge, as it were, like information. I mean, if you don't know it with information, somehow you know it. You know it in your guts. There's something, I think, in people that resigns. You know, when people talk a lot about political apathy, I think it's like, it's not apathy. It's a rational, that's that thing that's nothing to do with me. I don't participate in that.
Yeah, and we haven't given people the opportunity to be involved, particularly in radical politics. Radical has become a bad word in general, right? We throw it around about Islam and terrorism and et cetera, et cetera. But actually what we've done with this is we've completely misunderstood what radical is. So radicalism and jihadism or extremism are the complete opposite things, like completely and utterly opposite. How? So extremism is when you take the basic premise of a society or an idea and you take it way further than it makes any sense to take it, right? That's what we're having with these terrorists, right? That's the same as Nazis, that's the same as Christian fundamentalists, etc. And radicalism is the opposite. Radicalism, you take the fundamentals and you reject them. You say, well, actually, I don't want these. I don't like this. So you look at capitalism and you say, look, now I'm going to be a Marxist. Or you look at and you say, I'm going to be a radical, and you reject it. So in a sense, you can't actually have radical Islam, because radical Islam would cease to be Islam. It just wouldn't be, it would be something else. So we've completely conflated extremism and radicalism and made radical a dirty word. When actually radical, that's where we need to be. That's where we need to be pushing people towards.
That wasn't a coincidence then? You think that word has been deliberately tarnished?
Yeah, because if you think, only 50 years ago, late 60s, it wasn't, people really underestimate that the fact that we were on the precipice of global revolution. I mean, really. If you think of communism in the East, African continent, there's massive politics there. South America, there was a moment where it looked like the West may not win and it may not survive.
Wow.
And since then, they have just literally destroyed, with both violence, physical violence, and also symbolic violence, destroyed radicalism. So they told us that radicalism is bad, radicalism is wrong, radicalism is violent, radicalism is all these things, and pushed us away from those radical movements. But really, radical movements are the solution to these problems. The only solution, probably, to these problems.
I understand. So can we criticise some contemporary figures? You've got some proper provocative quotes and stuff. E.g., what about that? Theresa May is worse than Donald Trump. That's
was that provocative? I thought it was illogical.
Go on then, unpack it for us.
Well, and again, I quote Malcolm again. Literally, I just quote Malcolm X. I do quote other people as well, but he always seems to come up. That came from a paper I've just written, actually, in a book about Malcolm distinguished between the Southern wolf, who's kind of bares their teeth and are very aggressive and very openly racist, and you kind of know they're the problem because they're banging on your head and they'll shoot you, etc. But he actually says that worse than the Southern wolf is the Northern fox, who's tricky, who's cunning, who'll tell you everything's fine and there's whisper sweet nothings into your ear, but really they're just as bad. And if you think about racism at the time in America, and the civil rights movement, it was all about the South, and it was about, the Southern wolf. It was about segregation. It was about let's get rid of this overt racism. But then in the North, although you haven't got legal segregation, it's actually more segregated in the North than it is in the South. Look at today, nowadays, look at the police killings. They're usually in the North, not the South. Look at the ghetto. That's the North, often not the South as well. And so even though the North's telling you all these wonderful tales about itself, it's just as bad. And in some ways, it's worse than the South. And so this is the kind of thing I was saying with Theresa May. Donald Trump is the wolf. Very, very clearly, openly, he's a white supremacist, racist, obvious. He's quite proud of it. Seemingly
Do you think it actually is like a white supremacist racist, and that was revealed with that Charlottesville moment, or is there other stuff that makes
I think historically in the 90s there was a big case in Central Park where there was there was a rape in Central Park, and it was pinned on a group of gang rape. These African Americans were supposedly gang raped this white woman. Complete lie, complete fabrication. Who was there? Trump championed this myth. Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump was there, one of the worst offenders in this Central Park 5 rape case. Then you've got Barack Obama's not American. Who was championing that? It was Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump was hugely part of that. And now you've got the Muslim ban, you've got Charlottesville, you've got all these...
you look at it, that's very racist.
And he's just a racist. I mean, Donald Trump is a racist. Historically, presently, let's not be surprised. But Theresa May has tried to clothe herself in being, so when she was Home Secretary, she was... the police stop and search. She ordered a review into stop and search. Just the other day, she had all the anti-racist campaigners in her office around this. Let's talk about racism. Let's tell you the stats that I could have told you the day before. But anyway, we're going to have a big parade about how bad the country is. She likes to pretend that she's good on race, but she's terrible. I mean, as Home Secretary. If you look at the policy around migration, £3,000 visas for people from African countries, denying people entry into the country, she literally had a policy that said, we're not going to send boats into the Mediterranean to save drowning black people. We're just going to let them drown to deter other black people from coming. I mean, that's a dead Negro policy. That's what she's basically saying, right? And if you look at her government policy, look at what she's done around, she's terrible on race. But she presents herself as being someone you can talk to, someone you can relate to. That's the Northern wolf. And in that way, she's more dangerous.
Right. Yeah, I feel that's correct. I like that as a slogan, let's stop overt racism. So let's stop overt racism. Is this overt racism?
Yeah.
We've got to stop it. Kick overt racism out of football. Got to be much more subtle with the racism now.
Yeah, but like covert structural stuff. That's all right.
That's crafty racism. The Donald Trump argument. There's something like. Gosh, it's not an easy argument for a white person or an English person to make, and I'm both of those things. You're only one of them. So, is there something to be said that the grotesque amplification that Trump represents, the Southern Wolf argument, that there is something beneficial in that it's an unignorable, hideous carbuncle makes me, oh my God, we are now confronted with what our society means. Whereas as long as you had, as you said, there was a different kind of violence enmeshed in Barack Obama, in the concealment and the apparent, look, see, we've got a black president. Do you think that there is something, depending on where it leads to, almost, if not positive, cathartic about Donald Trump?
I say it might sound controversial, but I'd rather have Donald Trump as a president than Barack Obama. Honestly, I mean, really, in terms of race issues, it's just clear, it's obvious. It tells you exactly what you need to know about the society.
Yeah.
Whereas Obama's fronting, is making it seem like it's something it's not. And so if you look at the protests, you look at the movements, you look at people getting angry about things, that's there now, in a way it wasn't necessarily there. I mean, it's not like it wasn't there completely. I mean, Black Lives Matter emerges under Obama, partly because I think people were like, we've got a black president, shouldn't we expect a bit more?
Yes.
But I think if you look now, if you look at definitely the rhetoric around America's racist, this is a problem, da-da-da-da, I think you're seeing that come back more. And that's what we need. That's the starting point for the kind of politics that we need.
Donald Trump, hero of African America.
I won't go that far. but yeah, a better president for black. I will say, and I'll put it on record, Donald Trump is a better president for black America than Barack Obama.
Wow, that's cool. Because the thing that sort of where that appeals to me is that I think, and this is obviously a personal thing as opposed to a cultural thing for me, is I don't like bullshit. I don't like the feeling that we're not actually dealing with the problem. It's always made me feel uncomfortable, and it's made me want to tip over tables. It's made me want to be explosive and to sort of release a kind of shamanic volatility into the atmosphere, because I feel like, no, this isn't real. And it's something, it comes from a personal experience, but perhaps there isn't no distinction between personal political experiences on some level. I felt as a kid, something ain't right. And at school, I felt this isn't right. Like that, I feel like truth is not being conveyed on a very sort of practical level. Like while I was at school, feeling like I don't feel like this is a beneficial experience that I'm having, like I'm just in my little belly. So I would at least a sort of like, oh right, this geezer is an arsehole, as the president. Right, oh I get it now. See, now power isn't pretending to be your friend anymore. Yeah. And I don't see how the only sense of attachment or connection or affection that anyone could have with Donald Trump would be like, that guy looks like how I feel. I feel angry and I don't like life, and he looks like that feeling as a president. So I can't imagine how anyone could have any legitimate sense of allegiance. Don't you feel like? What do you feel like with that Charlottesville? Do you feel like? I don't suppose you don't feel like it's your problem, but sometimes when I feel like when white people are marching around with tiki torches in Charlottesville or whatever, and it's about a statue or something that seems to be sort of really necessarily and literally abstract in fact that it's dealing with a symbol, like your life will not get better if you pursue your argument to its natural conclusion of repatriation or whatever it is you're into. Your personal life will not improve. Do you not consider that to be part of the argument that is required by, say, black unity? Do you see it much more focusing on creating solidarity and momentum? Well,
no, I mean, this is the counter argument to the whiteness stuff. To say, well, actually, look at probably a chunk of the people in Charlottesville, a number of the people who vote for Donald Trump, white people, they're not really getting anything out of voting for Donald Trump. No. I mean, and voting to get rid of your healthcare. I mean, poor white people make these crazy decisions all the time to actually vote for things which make their situation much, much, much worse, right? And I guess that's the kind of counter argument to this whiteness thing. If you could tell people this, and if they could understand this, then maybe they would actually, their interests would be better served with the bigger lot of people, with everybody else, right? With a different kind of politics.
The thing that I've felt for a little while is that the way that power operates is there must be a strata of people and institutions for whom the way that systems operate are not problematic, for whom the systems are functioning correctly. There's a struggle. No, there is no problem because this is perfect. This is doing what it's meant to do. Then, right, and I sort of think, oh, okay, I'm not in that. Then there's another one that's a privileged elite that, whether it's like from someone like me that's from an entertainment background, that's like, oh, I'm pretty cool. I'm going to go where I want and do what I want as long as I don't rock the boat, as I found out when I did rock the boat, actually. And like, and then beyond that, it's just various degrees of fucked going down and down and down till you've got nothing. You know, and I think isn't part of the problem that people that it's very difficult that once you're, you know, both of us in our way are now included in culture in a way that's like, well, that's pretty good. We've got status, power. Yeah. So like that, most people go, oh, I don't seem as bad now, and like sort of and find it hard to, you know, what was that thing you said about privilege?
Divest your privilege.
Divest your privilege. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think this is part of the problem, but I think also it's really important to think about. If you say there's those layers of people who it's not a problem for, I would extend that to more people than probably most people would extend that to. And I think that's important, right? Even the poorest person in this country doesn't deal with child death, really, on a daily basis. Doesn't have those exclusions. And so there may be problems and there may be huge problems of inequality. But with the politics that we're mobilizing, are we just trying to make it a bit better for people here, or are we trying to make it better for everybody? And I think there is a consensus you could come to that say, well, look, you have a bit of rich, you have a bit of poor, we'll equal it out a bit, and everybody here will be perfectly happy. But it wouldn't solve the problem for child death and poverty outside.
I agree, and it must be taught to care. Kehinde, though, that argument can be made from the right to demotivate people. I think that even the poorest people in this country, you're doing all right. At least you're not dealing with like some dead kid in a mine. Like anymore. So like, you know, so it's difficult. So what do you think, being an educator, what do you think are the obligations from the perspective of education? What should we be being taught? The reality of colonialism and of imperialism, what impact would that have?
I mean, I think that's important. So what is the reality? Like, you think about empire and you think about, people don't know. You can't judge people for what they don't know. And unfortunately, we don't know. The system is terrible at telling us things which are really important. So I think teaching about empire, just teach just that. If you just say, well, let's teach an honest account of where did Britain get its wealth from? Where does Britain sustain its wealth today? And understand how the global system works and how the global system privileges us. Yeah. I think if you could just teach that, that would be a starting point.
Yeah.
But then but I think it's about more than that. So for example, with the Black Studies degree that we've started, we have these arguments, but then we put them into practice. So they say, well, actually, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to mobilize? What does that mean to how you act in the community? How do you, as an academic, I can't just be an academic, I have to be an activist. I have to be a member of the community. I have to be building these organizations and doing this work. And really teaching people that they have a responsibility to make this better. It kind of is incumbent on us with the privilege to make things better. I think that's important as well.
Both of those things are important. The first part, it seems like I can imagine that feeling like a kind of heresy, which makes me recognise again how arbitrary the distinction between what one calls the religious and what one calls the political, how that line is arbitrary. Because if you are in a school going, right, this is what the British Empire is, we've done this in India, done this in Africa, we've done that in Ireland, and that's how come you can have your Cocoa Pops. Enjoy lunch. I that feels like, no, don't say that. That's going to ruin everyone's morale. It's sports day tomorrow. Right, that's the first thing I wanted to say. And with that Black Studies course, how's it going? And how many people are on it? And is it all black people?
Yeah, so it's going well. First year, we've got about 20 students, which is what we expected to get, was our target to get. It is all black people for the first time. I'm sure in America, African American studies is lots of white people, Asian people. It takes a while to start off.
Yeah. What about that woman that felt like she was black and that? Do you remember that story? She goes,
which one? There's
is it a common idea? Is it? I feel like I'm black actually, so I am. What does that? Where do we go with that?
Is that interesting? Because I was at Duke University in May or something, and I was given a talk about blackness, etc., and African American Studies department, and somebody turned around and said, "Well, actually, the way you're talking about blackness being this political concept, etc., doesn't that mean Rachel Dolezal is black?" And I was shocked. I mean, I couldn't believe it because African American Studies, I thought there'd been a bit more nuance, let's say.
We've not really covered much. We're just sticking to the basics. Yeah. How long is this course? Half hour?
But I think something like that. I mean, if my argument is that the color of my skin is important because of the history of it and what it tells about me and what it tells me about the connections into, then you can't just fake that. Like, you can't just make that up. Like, if that's the thing that reunites you politically, then to pretend is to completely and utterly destroy any concept of unity in a sense. Yeah. So it's utterly offensive. But I would never get really mad about this because he's probably just got mental health problems. I mean, on a real level, like to want to be black, like to really want to be black. What is that? That takes a particular distorted view of the world.
I like the music and the edge, not so keen on the slavery.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I see. That's interesting because identity politics can become very divisive as well as creating great cohesion and momentum. And this is an odd moment, I feel, around these kind of ideas. And I suppose as a white male, I'm uniquely qualified to pontificate on all facets of that. Kehinde, that was an amazing interview. I really, really enjoyed it. I feel properly educated on a broad area of topics. Plus, we got stuck in with some real populism. I think notably the moment of Donald Trump is a better president for Black America than Barack Obama. That's some radicalism right here.
Hopefully, people's mothers will put a picture of Donald Trump on their wall after I said that.
I bet your mum cried when Donald Trump became president and all.
She's going to cry when she listens to this.
Nice one. Thanks, mate.
Thanks.
Cheers. This show was sponsored by my book, Recovery, which is a #1 bestseller in the United Kingdom, a New York Times bestseller. Go Amazon, get it wherever you are in the world, particularly Ireland, actually. We're not selling enough of them to Irish people. Come on, Irish people. You know I love you. I'm coming to your country soon. Also, come see me on my Rebirth tour. That's London, 31st of October, 1st of November. Remember, I'll be reading my book there, that special recovery event. Imagine coming there, having a book shouted in your face, getting something signed, then having a drink for half hour, then I come back out and start doing all my jokes. Oh, it's going to be great. November the 2nd, I'll be in Nottingham. 8th of November, Coventry. 13th, I'll be in Leicester. Ah, the glory of the Lord. Finally, if you like this show, subscribe to it, review it, give it a 5-star review. Use unusual language and words. Really express yourself in that review. I love you, and we will continue to learn together. Learn together. Learn together. Learn together. Learn together. Learn together. Learn together.